good evening and welcome. Settle in wherever you are, and let the weight of the whole long day slip quietly from your shoulders. Tonight, our story begins with a single old man, standing alone in a wind-blown field in the south of France, on a cold and gray autumn morning, more than 900 years ago. He had no army. He wore no crown. He carried no gold, and he offered none. He was only a churchman, weary and travel-worn, who climbed onto a simple wooden platform in the open air before a great waiting crowd and spoke to them for less than a single hour. And yet, from those few quiet words, something almost beyond belief was set loose upon the world. Within a few short years, tens of thousands of people, great lords and poor farmers alike, had sold their homes, sewn crosses of cloth onto their cloaks, and set out walking on foot more than 2,000 miles toward a single far-off city that most of them had only ever heard named in church. Many of them would never arrive. They would die of thirst in nameless deserts, of fever in strange valleys, of arrows in lands whose names they could not even say. They left behind everything they had ever known and marched east into the unknown, because they believed with their whole hearts that God Himself had asked it of them. That one sermon on that one cold morning lit a fire that would burn for 200 years. Again and again, wave upon wave of armed pilgrims would pour out of Europe and across the world toward the same small, sun-baked city of golden stone, the most bitterly fought-over place on the face of the earth. Its name was Jerusalem. This is the story of the Crusades, 2 long centuries of holy war for that one distant city. It is a story of soaring faith and terrible cruelty, of breathtaking courage and unimaginable suffering, of kings and beggars, of saints and butchers, all bound together upon the same long and bloody road. And what waited at the end of it would be remembered and argued over for very nearly 1,000 years. It is a very long story, and I mean to tell it slowly and gently from its very beginning to its very end, in no hurry at all, the way the best of tales are told at the close of a day. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to do, but let it carry you softly down towards sleep. So do not trouble yourself to hold on to any of it. There will be no test in the morning. You need not keep the names or the dates or remember which king or sultan came before which. That is my task and not yours. Your only task tonight is to rest. If you find that these slow, quiet histories help you to sleep night after night, you might think of subscribing to Lamplight History, but truly only if they bring you rest. There is no need and no hurry at all. I would far rather you drift away before the end than stay awake to press a single button. And if some small part of you is still gently awake, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the hour is where you lie. A great city near midnight, a quiet farmhouse before the dawn, a warm room somewhere with the rain against the glass. Leave a word in the comments, if you like, and tell me. It is a lovely thing to think of so many people in so many far-apart places, all drifting toward the same sleep, to the same old story. Now let us begin, not with the war, but with the world that gave it birth, as it was 1,000 years ago, long before that old man ever climbed onto his platform in the windy field. Close your eyes and picture the Europe of that distant age. It was a cold, dark, and violent land, a patchwork of small kingdoms and quarrelsome lords, of deep forests and muddy fields, of villages huddled low beneath grim stone castles, where life was short and hard, and lit from within only by the flickering candle of faith. For faith was the very air these people breathed. Above the smoke of their poor hearths rose the great gray cathedrals, and over every single life, from the king in his hall to the beggar at his gate, hung the vast and unquestioned shadow of the church, and of heaven far above, and of hell waiting below. They lived in daily fear of their sins, and of the fires that were said to await the wicked, and they longed more than anything for some way to wash those sins away. And of all the paths to forgiveness, the surest was thought to be the long and weary journey of pilgrimage, to leave everything behind and walk to a holy place, and there to kneel and pray. And far, far away to the east, across the whole breadth of the known world, beyond wide gray seas and unmapped mountains, lay the holiest place of all, the distant land where their faith had been born, where they believed their Lord himself had walked and taught and died. To journey there, just once, was the dream of a lifetime, and it is toward that far country that our long story is bound. So let the darkness gather softly around you now, as we go back to that faraway age. Dim the lights if they are not already low. Rest your head against the pillow and let your breath grow slow and slower still. There is nothing you need to do and nowhere at all you need to be. Let us begin gently at the very beginning with the world as it was in the last quiet years before the fire was lit. To understand how it all began, we must first look at the world as it lay 1,000 years ago, a world divided uneasily between two great faiths. In the west and the north stood Christendom, the lands of the Christians. Europe, still rough and poor, only lately risen from the long twilight that followed the fall of Rome. Its people were farmers and warriors, ruled by kings and knights, and bound together, above all else, by their shared belief. It was a hard and warlike age. The land was carved into countless little lordships, and the knights who held them were fighting men by trade and by blood, forever quarreling, raiding one another's fields, settling every dispute with the sword. Violence was woven into the very fabric of life. And the church, which taught peace, looked out upon this restless sea of armed and angry men, and wondered how their fury might ever be turned to some holier purpose. For the church was the one great power that reached into every life. In an age of darkness and fear, it offered light and meaning. The promise that this brief, painful life was but the doorway to an eternal one, and that what a soul did here would echo forever hereafter. Men lived in terror of their sins and of the fires of hell that awaited the wicked, and they longed, desperately, for some way to wash those sins away. One of the surest ways, they believed, was pilgrimage, to leave home and hearth and journey, on foot, to a holy place, and there to pray. And of all the holy places in the world, none was greater than Jerusalem, the city where their faith had been born. For centuries, a slow and steady stream of pilgrims had made that long and perilous road to the east, to walk where their Lord had walked, and to feel their sins fall away in the dust of the holy road. But Jerusalem, and the whole of the Holy Land around it, no longer lay in Christian hands. For far to the east and the south had risen the other great faith of that age, the faith of Islam, young and ardent and astonishingly strong. In a few short generations it had swept out of the deserts of Arabia and spread across half the world, from Spain in the west to the borders of India in the east, carried by armies of extraordinary conviction. And so, for some 400 years, the holy city of Jerusalem had been ruled by Muslim hands. This in itself had not meant war. For long stretches the Muslim rulers were tolerant masters, and Christian pilgrims still came and went in peace, paying their tolls and saying their prayers unmolested. The two faiths lived, warily, side by side, and the road to Jerusalem, though hard, stayed open. For Jerusalem was holy not to one faith, nor to two, but to three. To the Jews it was the city of David and of the great temple, the heart of their ancient homeland. To the Christians it was the place of their Lord's death and rising. And to the Muslims it was the third holiest city on earth, from which their prophet was believed to have ascended to heaven. Three faiths, all turning their eyes and their prayers toward the same small patch of sacred ground. And we should not imagine, as those distant Europeans often did, that the world of Islam was a place of darkness or barbarism. Quite the reverse. In those very centuries, while much of Europe lay poor and unlettered, the great Muslim cities shone as the brightest lamps of learning in the world. In Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba, scholars studied the stars and the workings of the body and the wisdom of the ancient Greeks in libraries larger than anything the West possessed. Their physicians were the finest of the age. Their mathematicians gave us the very numbers we still use today. Their poets and philosophers filled great libraries with works of beauty and subtlety. The traveler who journeyed east from the mud and timber of Europe into the stone cities of the Muslim world passed, in truth, from a poorer civilization into a richer one. This is worth remembering as the armies gather, for the two sides were not darkness and light, but two proud worlds, each certain that God was its own. And for the pilgrim in the long quiet years, the road to Jerusalem, though hard, was a wonder. He would travel for months, over sea and mountain and desert, footsore and weary, until at last he came within sight of the holy city, and there, like the crusaders who would come after him, he would very likely fall to his knees and weep. To walk the streets his Lord had walked, to pray at the tomb, to bathe in the sacred river. For such a moment, men would give the savings and the labor of a lifetime and count it cheap. Such a place could not stay peaceful forever. And in the 11th century, the fragile calm began to break. Out of the grasslands of Central Asia came a new and fierce people, the Seljuk Turks, who had lately embraced Islam with all the zeal of the newly converted. Hard riders and harder fighters, they swept into the Middle East, seized power from the older Muslim rulers, and pushed westward, hungry for conquest. The Turks were less patient with Christian pilgrims than the rulers before them had been. Reports drifted back to Europe, some true, some wildly exaggerated, of pilgrims robbed and beaten and turned away, of churches defiled, of the holy road grown dangerous once more. A slow anger began to smolder in the Christian West, a sense that something precious was being lost, that the sacred places were falling into unworthy hands. But it was not the pilgrims' plight alone that lit the fuse. It was the Turks' advance against the last great Christian power of the East, the Byzantine Empire. For in the East there still stood a Christian empire, ancient and proud, the surviving eastern half of Rome itself, ruled from the magnificent city of Constantinople, the greatest and richest city in all the Christian world. For centuries this empire had stood as a mighty wall, shielding Europe from the powers of the East. But now that wall was cracking. The Seljuk Turks fell upon its eastern provinces, and in a single terrible battle at a place called Manzikert, the emperor's great army was shattered and the emperor himself taken captive. The heartland of the empire, the rich country of Anatolia, lay suddenly open to the invaders. It was a catastrophe. Town after town, province after province, fell to the Turks, until their horsemen roamed almost within sight of Constantinople itself. The proud old empire, which had ruled the East for 1,000 years, found itself fighting for its very life. And its emperor, a shrewd and desperate man named Alexius, cast about for any help he could find. And so he did a thing that would change the world. He swallowed his pride and looked west, across the long divide that separated the Christians of the East from the Christians of the West, a divide of language, of custom, and of bitter old quarrels within the Church. And to the west, to the Pope in distant Rome, the Byzantine Emperor sent messengers, with a plea for aid against the advancing Turks. He asked, most likely, for a modest thing, for some hardy Western knights to come and serve as soldiers in his armies, to help him win back his lost lands. He can have had no idea what he was setting in motion. For his quiet request for help would fall upon the ears of a pope with a vision of his own, and out of it would come not a company of hired knights, but a vast and unstoppable flood, the like of which the world had never seen. The Pope who received that plea was a Frenchman named Urban, Pope Urban II, and he was one of the ablest men ever to hold that great office. He was a nobleman by birth, tall and commanding, with a gift for grand designs and a deep understanding of the hearts of men. And when the emperor's plea reached him, he saw in it not a small problem, but an enormous opportunity. For Urban dreamed of great things. He dreamed of healing the ancient rift between the Christians of East and West, and of drawing all Christendom together under the leadership of Rome. He dreamed of turning the endless, wasteful violence of Europe's knights away from one another and outward, toward a holy purpose. And he dreamed, above all, of the holy city of Jerusalem, groaning, as men now said, under the yoke of unbelievers. And so, in the autumn of the year 1095, Urban summoned a great council of the church to the town of Clermont, in the green heart of France. Churchmen came from across the land, and with them a great throng of knights and common folk, until the town could not hold them, and the crowd spilled out into the fields beyond the walls. There, in the open air, under a gray November sky, Urban mounted a high platform and prepared to speak. We do not know his exact words, for no one wrote them down as he spoke. But we know their effect, and it was like nothing before or since. He spoke of the Holy Land and of the sufferings of the Eastern Christians. He spoke of Jerusalem, the navel of the world, the city of the Lord, fallen into the hands of a people he called enemies of God. And he called upon the knights of the West to lay down their private quarrels and take up their swords in a far greater cause. Let those who had been fighting against their brothers, he cried, now fight against the infidel. Let those who had been robbers become soldiers of Christ. Let the rich and the poor alike go forth, and God himself would be their guide. And to any man who went, this was the heart of it, the promise that set the whole world alight. To any man who went, not for gain or glory, but out of true devotion, all the sins of his life would be washed away. It is hard, across the long centuries, to feel the full force of that promise. But to the men who heard it, it was almost beyond price. Here were warriors who had spent their lives in bloodshed, and who lived in daily terror of the hell they believed they had earned. And here suddenly was a road to heaven that ran straight through the one thing they knew how to do, to fight. Their trade and their salvation had become, in a single sermon, one and the same. The effect was electric. As Urban finished, a great cry went up from the crowd, rolling across the field like thunder, a cry that would become the war shout of the whole enterprise. God wills it, they roared. God wills it. It was as though a single thought had seized the entire multitude at once. Men wept and fell to their knees and cried out to be allowed to go. And there, on the spot, the first of them took the vow. As a sign of their pledge, they took strips of cloth and cut them into the shape of a cross, and sewed them onto their shoulders and their breasts. From that scrap of cloth came the very name of the whole endeavor, for the Latin word for cross gave us the word crusade, and those who wore it were, quite simply, the men of the cross. To take the cross was to bind oneself, body and soul, to the great journey. Urban had hoped, perhaps, for a strong army of knights. What he had unleashed was something far vaster and wilder than he had ever imagined. For as word of his sermon spread out from Clermont, carried by preachers across all of Europe, it did not stir only the knights. It stirred everyone. A great fever of holy longing swept the land, from the greatest lord in his castle to the poorest peasant in his hovel. Everywhere, men began to sew crosses onto their clothes and make ready to leave. They sold their farms and their tools, or mortgaged their lands to the church to pay for the journey. Whole families prepared to set out together. Preachers roamed the countryside, and wherever they spoke, the same holy madness took hold, until it seemed that half of Europe was on the move, or longing to be. There was no single leader, no plan, no map, scarcely any idea of how far away Jerusalem truly lay or what it would take to reach it. There was only the burning conviction that God had called, and that heaven itself lay at the end of the road. Some believed they would reach the holy city in a matter of weeks. Few had any notion of the deserts and the mountains, the hunger and the dying that lay between. It is one of the most astonishing moments in all of history, this sudden, spontaneous rising of a whole civilization, all at once, at the call of a single voice. Whatever we make of it now, whatever good and ill would flow from it, there is no denying its raw and terrible power, the power of an idea to seize hold of men's hearts and to send them marching, in their tens of thousands, toward a city most of them would never see. The date was set for the great departure, the following summer, when the harvest was in and the roads were dry. But not everyone was willing to wait. For the fever had spread fastest and burned hottest among the poor and the desperate, the very people with the least to lose. And they would not sit at home while the lords made their careful preparations. They would go now. And so the first and the most tragic of all the crusades was already stirring, the crusade of the common people. At the heart of this first great wave was a strange and compelling figure, a wandering preacher known as Peter the Hermit. He was a small, plain, unwashed man who rode about on a humble donkey, dressed in a coarse and filthy robe, eating little and sleeping rough. But when he opened his mouth to preach, something extraordinary poured out. Crowds gathered wherever he went and hung upon his every word and wept and followed him. Peter went from town to town across northern France and the German lands, and everywhere he passed, the poor rose up and joined him. Peasants and laborers, the old and the young, women and children, the crippled and the desperate. They left their villages and their fields and streamed after him in their thousands, until he led not an army but a vast, ragged, disorderly multitude, with almost no knights, no discipline, and no real notion of what lay ahead. They had little food, little money, and little idea of the distance before them. It is said that the children among them, seeing each new town along the road, would ask whether this, at last, was Jerusalem. They believed that God would provide, that the holy city was near, that their very poverty and faith would carry them through. And so, months before the great lords were ready, this human flood set out along the road to the east. But before it left the German lands, this first crusade did a terrible thing, the first of the many dark stains that would mark the whole enterprise. For some among these bands reasoned, in a twisted way, that if they had set out to fight the enemies of Christ far away, why should they spare the enemies they believed lived among them? And they turned upon the Jewish communities of the Rhineland in the towns along that great river. What followed was a horror. In city after city, mobs fell upon the Jewish quarters and demanded that the Jews abandon their ancient faith or die. Many local bishops, to their honor, tried to shelter them, throwing open their own houses and churches. But the mobs were beyond control, and in town after town whole communities were destroyed. It was a grievous crime, an outburst of blind hatred against a defenseless people, and it cast a long and shameful shadow across everything that came after. Let us not linger over that darkness, but let us not pretend it away either. It was there, at the very beginning, a reminder that this holy war carried within it, from the first, a terrible capacity for cruelty. And then the ragged host moved on eastward, out of the German lands and down toward the great river Danube, into the strange and unfamiliar country of Hungary and the Balkans. It is worth pausing on the sheer strangeness of this host, for it was like no army the world had seen. It was not one band but many, forming and reforming as it moved, with only a scattering of real knights among the multitude, men like the one history remembers by the unhappy nickname of Walter the Penniless. And running through the whole vast crowd like a fever was a wild and urgent expectation. A belief, whispered and then shouted, that the end of the world itself might be drawing near, and that to be found in Jerusalem when it came was the one thing in all the world that mattered. The march became a misery and a menace. This enormous, hungry crowd had to be fed, and there was never enough. When they could not buy food, they took it, and when the local people resisted, there was bloodshed. All along their route, they left anger and ruin behind them, and more than once they had to fight their way through lands that should have been friendly, losing many of their number to the swords of Christians as poor and frightened as themselves. Thinned and battered, but still vast, the survivors at last came within sight of their first great wonder, the mighty walls and shining domes of Constantinople, the imperial city, greater and richer than anything they had ever imagined. To these poor folk from the mud villages of the West, it must have seemed like a vision of heaven itself, a city out of a dream, its harbors crowded with ships, its markets heaped with the goods of all the world. The Emperor Alexius looked upon this ragged multitude with dismay. This was not the disciplined force of knights he had asked for. It was a shambling horde of paupers, already troublesome, already given to plunder. He fed them and gave them alms, and urged them wisely to wait on the near side of the water for the real armies that were coming behind them. But they would not wait. They had come to fight the Turks, and they clamored to be taken across. And so, to be rid of them, Alexius ferried them across the narrow strait, out of Europe and into Asia at last, onto the very edge of the Turkish lands. There he warned them again to stay together, to keep to their camp, and above all to wait for the knights. And there, freed from his restraining hand, the whole enterprise came swiftly and terribly apart. For the poor crusaders, hungry and unruly, would not sit still. Bands of them roamed out into the countryside to plunder, quarreling among themselves, some pushing recklessly toward the nearest Turkish stronghold in search of food and glory. The Turks, watching from the hills, saw an undefended rabble with no order and no discipline, and they laid their trap with a hunter's patience. Came in the autumn, not far from the coast. Lured out from their camp by false reports of easy victory, the great mass of the poor crusaders marched straight into a Turkish ambush in a narrow valley. Out of caution, let us not dwell on the details. It is enough to say that the Turkish horsemen fell upon them, and that the crusade of the common people was destroyed almost to the last soul. Of the many tens of thousands who had followed Peter out of the west, only a scattered handful lived to tell of it. Peter the hermit himself survived, for he had gone back across the water to Constantinople before the end. But his great host was gone, swallowed up in a foreign land, their bones left whitening in that far valley. It was a tragic and a fitting overture to all that would follow, proof, written in the very first chapter, that faith and courage alone were not enough, and that the road to the holy city would be paved with the bodies of the unready. The crusade of the poor was over. The crusade of the princes was only now beginning. While the poor had rushed ahead to their ruin, the great lords of Europe had been making ready in earnest. And these were a very different matter. For the men who now took the cross were among the mightiest warriors of the age, hardened knights and seasoned commanders, at the head of well-armed and well-provisioned companies. They came from every corner of the West, and though they owned no single leader, together they formed the most formidable army Europe had sent forth in centuries. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, a tall, fair, pious duke from the borderlands, so devoted that he had sold and mortgaged his lands to fund the journey, and would come to be seen as the very ideal of the Christian knight. There was his brother Baldwin, colder and more ambitious, with a sharp eye for his own advantage. Together they led a great host down from the German lands. From the south of France came Raymond of Toulouse, the oldest and richest of all the leaders, a proud and stubborn count who had already fought the Muslims in Spain, and who fancied himself the natural commander of the whole enterprise. He brought a great army, and a great opinion of himself, and a churchman of high rank to serve as the Pope's own representative among the Crusaders. And from the lands of southern Italy came perhaps the most dangerous and brilliant of them all, Bohemond, a Norman adventurer, tall and golden-haired and cunning as a fox. He was a landless younger son who had spent his life fighting for whatever he could seize, and he saw in this holy war a golden chance to carve out a princedom of his own in the East. With him rode his nephew Tancred, a young knight as bold and able as himself. There were others too, Robert, the easygoing Duke of Normandy, who had pawned his whole duchy to go, and counts and knights beyond counting, each with his own following. They did not march as one. They came by different roads, in separate armies at different times, held together only by their shared vow and their common goal. But all of them, by different paths, were converging on the same place, the great city of Constantinople. The Emperor Alexius awaited their coming with very mixed feelings. He had asked for soldiers, and now a flood of them was descending upon him. But they were proud, unpredictable Western lords, some of whom, like Bohemond, had actually made war upon his empire in the past. They were as much a danger as a help. To have such men and such armies gathering outside his walls was like holding a lighted torch in a room full of straw. So Alexius played a careful and clever game. As each great lord arrived, he received him with dazzling splendor, showering him with gold and silks and precious gifts, feasting him in his marble halls, overwhelming these rough Westerners with the sheer wealth and majesty of his court. And then, having charmed them, he asked of each a solemn promise, an oath of fealty, swearing that whatever lands they took from the Turks, if those lands had once belonged to his empire, they would hand back to him. It was a shrewd bargain and a tense one. Some of the lords swore the oath readily enough. Others bristled and resisted, for they had not come all this way to win lands for a Greek emperor. There were hard words and veiled threats, and moments when it seemed it might come to open war between the Crusaders and the very empire they had come to aid. But in the end, one by one, the great lords gave their word, and Alexius, satisfied, made ready to send them on their way. Between the Westerners and the Byzantines there lay a deep and mutual distrust that would never truly heal. The Crusaders thought the Greeks soft, treacherous, and proud. The Greeks thought the Westerners crude, greedy, and dangerous. Each needed the other, and neither quite trusted the other, and from that poisoned root would grow, in time, some of the bitterest fruit of the whole crusading age. But for now the alliance held. While their lords bargained, the common crusaders wandered the greatest city in the Christian world with their mouths agape. Nothing in the rough West had prepared them for Constantinople. It held perhaps 500,000 souls, at a time when a great town of Europe might hold 10,000. It had paved streets and marble squares, aqueducts and vast markets heaped with the goods of all the earth, and churches beyond number, and walls so strong that no enemy had broken them in 700 years. Above it all rose the enormous dome of the great Church of Holy Wisdom, so vast and so lovely that visitors could find no words for it, and felt, they said, as though they stood in heaven itself. And the city was crammed with the holiest relics of Christendom, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, the bones of apostles and saints. The rough newcomers gazed and marveled, and some of them, being who they were, also quietly reckoned how such treasures might one day be carried off. We know, remarkably, how the Greeks saw these strange Western guests, for the emperor's own daughter grew up to be a scholar, and long afterward she wrote a history of her father's reign. She watched these Frankish lords parade through the court when she was a girl, and she described them with a sharp and sometimes wicked eye, half admiring and half appalled. The Franks, she thought, were brave to the point of madness. A Frankish knight, she wrote, would charge through the very gates of hell itself, if only you pointed him at them. Alexius gave them guides and supplies, and the promise of his support, and ferried their great host across the water into Asia, as he had ferried the poor before them. But these were no rabble. As the crusading army gathered on the Asian shore, its true size and strength became plain. Many thousands of mounted knights, the finest heavy cavalry in the world, and many more thousands of foot soldiers, a vast and disciplined force burning with faith and purpose. Ahead of them lay the whole breadth of Anatolia, hundreds of miles of harsh, dry, mountainous country, held by the Seljuk Turks, whose swift horse archers had already destroyed the poor crusaders and defeated the emperor's own armies. The crusaders knew little of this land, of its terrible heat and its scarcity of water, of the enemy's cunning way of war. They knew only that the road to Jerusalem ran through it, and so through it they would go. Their first great test lay close at hand. The city of Nicaea, a strong and beautiful place ringed by mighty walls, standing beside a wide lake. It was the capital of the local Turkish Sultan, and it barred the road east. Before the Crusaders could march on toward the holy city, they would have to take it. And so, in the spring, the great host moved up to the walls of Nicaea, and the war for the Holy Land began in earnest. Rest now if you are drifting, for the long march is about to begin. The talking and the planning are done. The oaths are sworn. The vast army stands upon the edge of the enemy's country, its banners bright in the eastern sun. Ahead lie 3 long and terrible years of siege and battle, of triumph and starvation, before the holy city is reached at last. But that is all to come. For now, let the quiet of the night settle over you, as the Crusaders make their camp beneath the walls of Nicaea. The siege of Nicaea was the Crusaders' first true trial, and they set to it with grim determination. They ringed the great walls with their camps, and battered the towers with their engines, and beat back the Turkish Sultan when he came with an army to relieve the city. The Sultan, seeing the size and ferocity of this new enemy, drew off in dismay to gather his full strength. And within the walls, the defenders began to lose hope. But Nicaea stood beside a wide lake, and so long as the Turks held the water, they could bring in supplies and never be truly starved out. So the Crusaders, with the emperor's help, hauled boats overland and launched them upon the lake, and closed the last road of escape. The city was surrounded now on every side. This fall was only a matter of time. And then, one morning, the Crusaders awoke to a strange and galling sight. In the night, the defenders had secretly surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but to the Emperor Alexius. The imperial banners now flew from the towers. Alexius, unwilling to see the rich city sacked and burned, had made his own quiet bargain with the Turks inside. To the Crusaders, who had done the fighting and the bleeding, and who had looked forward to the plunder, it felt like a cheat and a betrayal. Their distrust of the Greeks hardened another notch. Still, Nicaea had fallen, and the road east lay open. The great army set out across Anatolia, and almost at once the Turks struck. Near a place called Dorylaeum, the Crusaders had divided their host into 2 columns, and the swift Turkish horsemen fell upon the first of these, Bohemon's column, in overwhelming numbers, swirling around it in a storm of arrows, their light riders darting in and away faster than the heavy knights could catch them. For hours it hung in the balance. The Crusaders, unused to this darting, stinging way of war, were driven back into a desperate huddle, the knights and the foot soldiers and the women and the priests all pressed together, praying as the arrows rained down. Bohemond held them steady, riding up and down the line, forbidding any man to break. And then, at the crucial moment, the second column came up over the hills at the enemy's rear. Caught between the 2 Crusader forces, the Turks broke and fled, abandoning their camp and their treasure. It was a great victory, and a vital one. The Crusaders had learned that they could beat the Turks in open battle, if only they kept their nerve and their discipline. And the Sultan, twice worsted, drew back and left them to the land itself, for he knew that the land might do what his horsemen could not. And so began the true ordeal, the long march across the burning heart of Anatolia in the full heat of high summer. The Sultan had laid the country waste before them, burning the crops and fouling the wells, so that the army moved through an empty, blasted land under a merciless sun. There was no shade and little water, and the heat lay upon them like a weight. The suffering was terrible. Men and animals died of thirst upon the road. The great war horses, so precious and so proud, perished by the hundreds, until knights who had ridden out in glory now trudged on foot, or rode upon oxen, or upon little donkeys, their armor carried by the few beasts that survived. Dogs and goats were pressed into service as pack animals. The proud army was reduced to a straggling, footsore column, dragging itself eastward through the dust. And yet they went on. Whatever else may be said of them, the courage and the endurance of these people were almost beyond belief. Sustained by their faith, by the conviction that every hardship washed away their sins and brought them nearer to heaven, they bore what would have broken almost anyone else. They buried their dead and shouldered their burdens and put one weary foot before the other, day after scorching day, toward a city still hundreds of miles away. As they went, the great enterprise began quietly to fracture, for ambition rode with them as well as faith. Baldwin, the cold and clever brother of Godfrey, peeled away from the main army with a small force and struck out on his own to the east, toward the rich Armenian Christian city of Edessa, beyond the river. The local people, Christians chafing under Turkish overlords, welcomed him. And by a mixture of charm and cunning and no small ruthlessness, Baldwin made himself the master of the city. And so, almost by accident, the first of the Crusader states was born, the county of Edessa, a Christian lordship in the east, ruled by a Western knight far from home. It was a sign of things to come. For beneath the shining banner of the holy pilgrimage, there ran always this second current, the hunger of landless younger sons for lands and lordships of their own. Faith and greed marched together, tangled inextricably, all the way to Jerusalem and beyond. Beyond the burning plateau there rose a new torment, the mountains. To come down into Syria, the army had to cross a high and cruel range by a narrow track that clung to the sides of deep ravines, slick with mud and rain. It was one of the most wretched passages of the whole march. Pack animals lost their footing and tumbled shrieking into the gorges, dragging their loads and sometimes a whole roped line of beasts after them into the depths. So steep and so terrible was the path that knights, in despair, tried to sell their armor for a pittance, or simply flung it away rather than carry it another step, and men who had ridden out of Europe as proud warriors crept over the passes on their hands and knees. The chroniclers, who seldom complained, remembered that mountain crossing as a place of real horror, and were thankful beyond words to come down alive on the far side. But come down they did into gentler country, and here at last they found friends. For these were the borderlands of Syria, home to great numbers of Eastern Christians, Armenians and others, who had lived for generations under Turkish rule, and who welcomed the Crusaders as liberators and as brothers in the faith. After months of marching through emptied and hostile land, the weary army found open markets and friendly faces and guides who knew the country. The kindness of those Eastern Christians was a great and reviving mercy. The main army, meanwhile, pressed on through the mountains and came down at last, in the autumn, into the greener country of Syria. And there, before them, rose the object of their next and greatest trial, the vast and ancient city of Antioch. Once one of the chief cities of the Roman world, and one of the cradles of the Christian faith, it was now a mighty Turkish fortress, and it stood squarely across the road to the Holy Land. Antioch was enormous and enormously strong. Its walls ran for miles, up and over a steep mountain, studded with hundreds of towers, so vast that the Crusaders' whole army could not fully surround it. Within lay a large and determined garrison and ample stores. To take such a place by storm was all but impossible. To starve it out would take an age. The Crusaders looked upon those endless walls as the autumn turned to winter, and settled down to the longest and most desperate ordeal of the entire journey. The siege of Antioch would last for many months, through the whole of a long and bitter winter, and it would bring the Crusaders lower than they had ever been. At first they camped before the walls in confidence, feasting on the plentiful food of the rich Syrian countryside. But such a host devours a land quickly, and as the weeks stretched into months, and the winter closed in cold and wet, the plenty turned to want, and the want to famine. It became a season of misery almost beyond telling. The winter rains poured down upon the flimsy camps, the tents rotted, and the men shivered in the mud. Food ran short and then ran out. The price of what little remained rose beyond all reason. Men ate their precious horses, and then the pack animals, and then things far worse. Disease crept through the wretched camp. The starving died in their tents, and were buried in the sodden ground, and still the great walls stood, untaken and seemingly untakeable. The spirit of the army began to break. Men slipped away in the night and stole back toward home, unable to bear it any longer. Even some of the leaders wavered. One great lord deserted to his lasting shame. Peter the hermit himself, that spark of the whole enterprise, was caught trying to flee and had to be shamed back into the camp. It seemed that winter, that the whole magnificent, foolhardy pilgrimage might simply dissolve into the mud before the walls of a single city. Twice during that long winter, great Muslim armies marched to break the siege and destroy the Crusaders, and twice they were turned back. The lords of Damascus and of Aleppo each in turn led a host against the ragged besiegers, and each time Bohemond, choosing his ground with care, met them where their greater numbers could not tell, and beat them and sent them reeling home. These hard-won victories kept the siege alive, But they filled no empty bellies, and the famine within the camp ground on as pitiless as before. And into this desperate hour stepped the cunning of Bohemond. For all along, the Norman had been playing his own deep game. He had, in secret, made contact with a man inside the city, a captain of one of the towers, disaffected and open to a bribe. Quietly, patiently, Bohemond wove his web. But he was no fool, and he meant to be paid for it. He went before the other leaders and offered to deliver the city, on one condition: that Antioch, once taken, should be his. It was a bold demand, and it flew in the face of their oaths to the emperor. Proud Raymond of Toulouse resisted it bitterly. But the army was dying, and there was no other hope in sight, and in the end the leaders agreed. Whoever gained them entry to the city should have it. And so, on a dark night in the early summer, after the siege had ground on for the better part of a year, Bohemond's secret bargain came due. Under cover of darkness, the traitor within lowered a ladder from his tower, and a picked band of crusaders crept up it, one by one, hearts pounding, into the sleeping city. They seized the tower, and then the neighboring ones, and threw open a gate. And then the whole army poured in through the streets in the gray light of dawn, and Antioch, which had defied them for so long, fell in a single wild and dreadful morning. Let us pass gently over what followed in those streets. It was the fury of desperate and starving men, and it was not gentle. The Crusaders had their city at last. But their triumph curdled almost at once into a fresh and even deadlier peril. For at that very moment, a great Muslim army was marching to Antioch's relief. An enormous host, gathered from across the region under a powerful lord named Kerboga, coming to crush the Crusaders once and for all. And it arrived just days after the city fell. And so the besiegers became the besieged. The Crusaders, exhausted, starving, having just won the city at such cost, now found themselves trapped inside it, ringed about by a fresh and mighty enemy far larger than themselves. The great host of Kerboga covered the hills and the plains around Antioch. There was no food within the walls, and no way out, and no hope of rescue. It was, by any reckoning, the end. Despair fell upon them like a shroud. Men hid in their houses, or crept over the walls by night and fled. The leaders met in grim council and could see no way through. They were too weak to fight their way out, and too starved to hold out for long. Everything they had suffered, the deserts, the thirst, the famine, the long dying, had brought them to this, to perish at last in a foreign city, within reach of the Holy Land they would never see. And then came one of the strangest episodes in the whole strange story. A poor and humble pilgrim came forward, claiming to have seen visions. In these visions, he said, a saint had revealed to him a wondrous secret, that buried beneath the floor of the great church of Antioch lay one of the holiest relics in all of Christendom, the very lance that had pierced the side of their Lord upon the cross. Let them dig for it, and it would be the sign of their deliverance. They dug. For hours the men labored in the floor of the church and found nothing, while the crowd watched and prayed. And then the visionary himself leapt down into the pit and reached into the earth and drew forth a piece of iron and cried out that here indeed was the holy lance. Whether it was truly what he claimed, or whether he had hidden it there himself, no one can now say. But the effect upon that despairing army was electric. A wild new hope surged through the Crusaders. Here was a sign that God had not abandoned them after all, that heaven itself was with them, that the relic of their Lord would lead them to victory against all the odds. Starving, ragged, outnumbered many times over, they resolved to do the only thing left to them, to march out of the gates and fall upon the vast army of Kerboga in open battle, and to trust the rest to God. And so, on a summer morning, the gates of Antioch opened, and the Crusaders came out, thin and hollow-eyed, many on foot, their banners raised, the holy lance carried before them, singing hymns as they advanced against a foe that outnumbered them beyond counting. By every rule of war, they should have been swept away. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The great Muslim host, riven by its own bitter quarrels and rivalries, did not hold together. As the desperate, exalted Crusaders pressed forward, the alliance against them cracked and crumbled. One faction and then another turned and rode from the field, unwilling to die for a cause not their own, until the whole enormous army dissolved into flight before a starving remnant. It was, to the Crusaders, nothing less than a miracle, proof beyond doubt that God fought at their side. Antioch was saved. The road to Jerusalem was open once more, and the holy city at long last lay within their reach. Yet even now, with the way clear at last, the Crusaders did not press on. For a strange thing had happened to them. Having endured so much to reach the Holy Land, they now fell to quarreling among themselves and lingered for many months at Antioch. Bohemond, having won the city, meant to keep it and would not stir. The others argued over what to do, and a plague swept the camp, carrying off the Pope's own representative. The great enterprise stalled, becalmed by ambition and disease. It was the common soldiers, in the end, who forced the issue. Weary of their leaders' squabbling, they threatened to march on Jerusalem without them, or to tear down the walls of the cities the lords were fighting over, so that no one could have them. Shamed and pressed, the great host at last gathered itself and moved south, leaving Bohemond to his prize at Antioch, and following old Raymond and Godfrey down the long road toward the city they had crossed the world to reach. They marched down the coast of the Holy Land in the early summer, and now, so near the end, fortune smiled upon them. The local rulers, divided and afraid, chose to let them pass rather than fight, selling them food and standing aside. And so, after 3 years, after all the deserts and the sieges and the dying, the ragged remnant of that vast host came up, one bright June morning, into the hills of Judea, and saw at last rising before them the walls and towers of Jerusalem. At the sight of the holy city, the whole army was overcome. Hardened knights and common soldiers alike fell to their knees in the dust of the road, and wept, and gave thanks, and kissed the sacred ground. Some could not speak for weeping. This was the place of which they had dreamed through every hardship, the city for which so many thousands of their companions had died along the way. They had reached it. After everything, they had truly reached it. But Jerusalem would not fall for the weeping of pilgrims. It was a strong city, well-walled and well-defended, and its garrison had prepared for a siege, driving off the livestock, poisoning or blocking the wells outside the walls, so that the attackers would find no water. And the crusaders who now stood before it were pitifully few. Of the great multitude that had set out from Europe, only a fraction remained, worn thin by 3 years of war and want. The siege that followed was an ordeal in itself. It was high summer in the Judean hills, and the heat was ferocious. With the wells stopped, the crusaders suffered terribly for water, trudging miles to distant springs and carrying it back in stinking skins, while their enemies watched and mocked from the walls. There was little wood in that bare country to build the engines they needed. Their first, hasty assault was thrown back with heavy loss. And a Muslim army was said to be gathering in Egypt to relieve the city. They were saved by good fortune and hard labor. Ships from the west put in at a nearby port, bringing supplies and, above all, timber and craftsmen. With this and with wood hauled from far away, the crusaders set to building great siege towers, tall wooden castles on wheels, high enough to overtop the walls. For weeks they labored in the heat, and the defenders labored too, raising their defenses to meet them. And as the work neared its end, a wave of religious fervor swept the camp. Told by their priests to purify themselves, the whole army fasted, and then walked in solemn procession, barefoot, all the way around the walls of the city, praying and singing, while the defenders jeered from above. It was a strange and moving sight, this small, sunburnt, desperate host, circling the great walls in bare feet, seeking heaven's favor for the assault to come. And then, their devotions done, they rolled their towers up to the walls, and the final battle began. The assault raged for the better part of 2 days and a night. Under a storm of arrows and stones and fire, the crusaders pushed their great towers against the walls and fought to bridge the terrible gap. Again and again they were thrown back. And then, at last, on the second day, near one of the towers, a few knights managed to fling a bridge across and win a footing upon the wall. More followed, and then more, and the defense gave way, and the crusaders were into the city at last. What happened next is among the darkest passages in the whole history of these wars, and I will not dwell upon it. It is enough to say that the crusaders, maddened by 3 years of suffering and by the fervor of the moment, showed little mercy to the people they found within. A great and terrible slaughter followed, of Muslims and Jews alike, that horrified even that hard age, and that would be remembered with bitterness for many centuries to come. Let us draw the veil over that dreadful day and only mourn it. And so, On a July day in the year 1099, after 4 years and untold thousands of lives, the crusade reached its impossible goal. Jerusalem was taken. Against every expectation, against famine and thirst and overwhelming odds, that first great pilgrimage of the sword had done the thing it set out to do. In the churches of the captured city, the surviving crusaders gathered, still stained with the horrors of the assault, and wept and prayed, and gave thanks to the God they believed had led them there. Now the victors had to decide who should rule the holy place they had won. Proud Raymond, offered the crown, refused it, for he said no man should wear a crown of gold in the city where his Lord had worn a crown of thorns. And so the honor fell instead to Godfrey of Bouillon, the pious duke, beloved of the army. He too would not be called king in Jerusalem. He took instead a humbler title, defender of the Holy Sepulchre, guardian of the tomb of Christ. The first crusade was over, and it had succeeded beyond all reason, the only one of all the great crusades that would truly achieve its goal. But its success had created something new and strange and fragile, a cluster of Christian lands, far from home, planted in a hostile world. Most of the crusaders, their vow fulfilled, now turned and began the long journey back to Europe to tell their tale. And behind them, a small band of the faithful remained to hold what had been won. A Christian kingdom in the heart of the Holy Land, ringed on every side by enemies. The lands the Crusaders had won came to be known, in time, by a single evocative name, Outremer, a French word meaning simply the land beyond the sea. It was a long, thin ribbon of territory strung along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, a chain of principalities and counties, with the kingdom of Jerusalem at its heart, and Antioch and Edessa and later Tripoli, all held by Western lords who had stayed to rule what their swords had taken. It was a most peculiar world, this Outremer. A small ruling class of Western knights and their families found themselves lords over a vast and varied population, Muslims, Jews, and a great many Eastern Christians of ancient traditions very different from their own. The newcomers were always few, always outnumbered, always aware that they lived upon a knife's edge, surrounded by peoples they had conquered and by kingdoms that longed to drive them back into the sea. And yet, for a while, it worked. The Western settlers learned, slowly, to live in their new land. They grew used to its fierce sun and its strange foods and its many peoples. Some came to prefer the silks and the spices and the warm baths of the East to the rough life they had left behind. Trade flourished through their ports. Pilgrims came once more in safety to pray at the holy places. A whole new society took root, half European and half Eastern, unlike anything before it. But it was always and forever a fortress society, living under the shadow of war. And so its greatest and most characteristic works were its castles. Across the length of Outremer, the Crusaders raised some of the mightiest fortresses the world has ever seen. Vast, brooding piles of golden stone upon the hilltops, with walls within walls and towers upon towers, built to be held by a few against very many. Some of them stand to this day, and even in ruin they take the breath away. Yet castles are held by men, and men were the one thing Outremer never had enough of. Every year the Crusaders who had won the land grew older, and every year too few came from the west to replace them. The kingdom bled slowly for want of soldiers. And out of this desperate need was born one of the most remarkable institutions of the whole medieval age. A new kind of man, who was at once a monk and a warrior, sworn to poverty and prayer, and to lifelong war against the enemies of his faith. The first of these were the Knights Templar. They began as a tiny band of knights who took vows of poverty and chastity, and dedicated themselves to protecting the pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. They took their name from the Temple of Jerusalem, near which they were housed. And from these humble beginnings they grew, in time, into something extraordinary. A great order of warrior monks, disciplined, fearless, and utterly devoted, the shock troops of the Christian East. Beside them rose a second order, the Knights Hospitaller, who had begun by caring for sick and weary pilgrims in a great hospital in Jerusalem, and who took up the sword as well to defend those they had healed. These two orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, became the backbone of Outremer's defense. They garrisoned the great castles and formed the hard core of every Crusader army, and gave their lives without stint in the endless war. They were a strange and awesome sight, these warrior monks. Men who owned nothing, who prayed like the most devout of monks and fought like lions, who were forbidden to retreat unless the odds against them were overwhelming, and who therefore died very often where they stood. In an age that prized both faith and courage above all things, they seemed to embody both to the highest degree. And in time, the Templars especially grew rich and powerful, and spread across all of Europe, and their story would end in mystery and tragedy, but that is a tale for another night. Of all the wonders the Crusaders raised in that land, none were greater than their castles, and the mightiest of them stands, in part, to this day. High on a ridge in Syria rose the great fortress that the Hospitaller Knights made their own. A vast double ring of golden stone, with walls within walls and towers upon towers, storehouses to outlast the longest siege, and halls where a garrison could live for years. It was reckoned all but impregnable, and travelers who saw it called it the finest castle in all the world. Even now, in ruin, it takes the breath away. And in the shadowed hills of that same country dwelt one of the strangest powers of the whole age, a secretive sect, feared by Christian and Muslim ruler alike, who made a weapon not of armies but of murder. From their mountain strongholds, their master sent out devoted followers, trained in patience and disguise, to strike down the great and powerful with a hidden dagger, often in the midst of their own guards. So dreaded were they, and so shrouded in dark legend, that their very name has come down to us, across the centuries, as a word for a killer sent in secret, the assassins. Yet between the wars and the terrors, ordinary life somehow went on, and it was a stranger, richer life than the settlers had known at home. The children and grandchildren of the first Crusaders grew up under the eastern sun, and many came to prefer its ways, the silks and the spices, the warm baths, the fruits and the learning of the East, to the rough world their fathers had left behind. In the markets of Jerusalem and Acre, Christian, Muslim, and Jew traded side by side, And for a while in that narrow land, three faiths lived close together, in wary peace as often as in war. The little kingdom then held on, defended by its castles and its warrior monks, sustained by the trade of its ports and the faith of its pilgrims, and by the occasional arrival of fresh crusaders from the west. Godfrey, its first ruler, died young, only a year after the great victory, and his brother Baldwin, the same cold, ambitious Baldwin who had seized Edessa, came south to take his place. And Baldwin, less troubled by humility, did what Godfrey would not. He had himself crowned king of Jerusalem. Baldwin proved a capable and ruthless king, and under him and those who followed, the kingdom of Jerusalem reached its height. Its borders were secured. Its enemies, for the moment, were divided and distracted. Its cities and its trade prospered. For a generation and more, it seemed that the impossible thing the First Crusade had built might actually endure, a Christian realm in the Holy Land, holding its own in a hostile world, a wonder and a marvel to all of Christendom. But its safety was always an illusion, resting less on its own strength than on the disunity of its foes. The Muslim world around it was, for now, fractured into rival princedoms that spent as much energy fighting one another as fighting the invaders. So long as that remained true, Outremer could survive in the gaps between its enemies. But it was a dangerous thing to build a kingdom upon the quarrels of others. For if ever those quarrels should cease, if ever the Muslim world should unite under a single strong hand, then the reckoning would come. And far away, unseen, that day was already drawing nearer. In the great cities of Syria and Egypt, new leaders were rising who dreamed of turning back the Christian tide, and who preached, as Urban had once preached, a holy war of their own, a struggle to drive the foreigners from the sacred soil and to take back the holy city. The long peace of Outremer's golden years was a lull, not an ending. The storm was only gathering its strength. So rest now, in this quiet hour between the storms, while the little kingdom still stands in the eastern sun. The great victory has been won. The castles rise golden upon the hills. The pilgrims come and go in peace. Let the crusaders enjoy their brief and shining summer before the shadows lengthen. For the story is far from over, and harder days are coming. But they are not here yet. For now, there is only the warm night, and the quiet, and the slow, sweet drift towards sleep. The first blow fell upon the weakest and most exposed of the Crusader lands, the county of Edessa, far to the east, the very first state the Crusaders had founded. A powerful and ruthless Muslim lord named Zengi, the first of the new leaders who dreamed of driving out the foreigners, fell upon Edessa while its count was away, and after a short, sharp siege, he took it. The oldest of the Crusader states had fallen, and its Christian population was scattered or slain. The news struck Europe like a thunderclap. Nearly 50 years had passed since the triumph of the First Crusade, and a whole generation had grown up believing that God's favor rested upon the Holy Land forever. Now suddenly the tide had turned. If Edessa could fall, then so one day might Jerusalem itself. A cry went up across Christendom for a new crusade, to restore what had been lost and to shore up the trembling kingdom in the east. The call was taken up by the most revered holy man of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk of such piety and eloquence that his word carried across all of Europe. As Urban had once preached the first crusade, so now Bernard preached the second, and with the same electrifying effect. Wherever he spoke, men wept and clamored to take the cross. It is said the crosses he had brought to hand out ran short, and he tore up his own robe to make more. This time it was not mere counts and dukes who answered, but crowned kings. Louis, the young and devout king of France, took the cross, and with him his queen and a great host of French nobility. And Conrad, the powerful king of Germany, took it too and gathered a mighty army of his own. Two royal hosts, vast and glittering, prepared to march east, the greatest force to set out for the Holy Land since the first great venture. Hopes ran high. Surely, with two kings at its head, this crusade could not fail. It failed almost at once and utterly. The two armies marched separately across Anatolia, along the same hard roads that had nearly destroyed the first Crusaders, and this time there was no miracle. The German king went first, and his great host was ambushed and shattered by the Turks in the barren hills, cut to pieces, so that only a broken remnant staggered back. The French army fared little better, harried and starved and bled white on the terrible march, until it too was a shadow of what had set out. The survivors of both royal armies, thinned and demoralized, made their way at last to the Holy Land, not as a conquering force, but as battered pilgrims who had lost their armies on the road. And there, the leaders of the crusade and the lords of Jerusalem met in grand council to decide how to use what strength remained. And they made a decision so strange and so foolish that historians have puzzled over it ever since. They resolved to attack Damascus. Now Damascus, of all the Muslim cities, was the one that had been most friendly to the kingdom of Jerusalem, a natural ally, wary of the greater powers rising around it, and long at peace with the Christians. To attack it was to drive the one friendly neighbor straight into the arms of the enemy. But attack it they did, marching their combined host up to its walls in the summer heat, and laying siege to the great city. The siege was a fiasco from the start. Through some mixture of poor planning, mutual distrust, and the jealousy of the local lords, the Crusaders moved their camp from a well-watered position to a dry and exposed one, and there found themselves without water, under the walls of a city whose defenders grew stronger by the hour as help poured in. Within a few short days, their grand enterprise had collapsed into a shambles. After only 4 days, the great army of two kings turned around and retreated from Damascus in disorder and disgrace, harried by the enemy every step of the way, having achieved precisely nothing. It was a humiliation almost beyond bearing. The mightiest crusade since the first, led by two of the greatest kings in Europe, blessed by the holiest man of the age, had marched across the world only to fall apart, ingloriously, beneath the walls of a city that had been its friend. The kings went home, their armies gone, their reputations in ruins, their great venture a byword for failure. And the damage ran far deeper than one lost siege. The Second Crusade had shattered the aura of invincibility that had clung to the crusading movement since Jerusalem fell. It had taught the Muslim world that the Crusaders could be beaten, and beaten badly. And by its senseless attack, it had turned friendly Damascus into an enemy, and pushed it toward the very man who was now rising to unite the Muslim East against them. For the failure of the Second Crusade did more than dishearten the West. It strengthened immeasurably the cause of Muslim unity. The lords of Islam had seen the invaders humbled, and they took heart. The dream of a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem, once scattered and faint, now began to gather force and focus. And it found, in the years that followed, a succession of leaders able and determined enough to make it real. First among them was Nur ad-Din, the son of Zengi who had taken Edessa, a stern, pious, and formidable ruler who spent his life knitting together the quarreling princedoms of Syria under his single hand, and who preached the holy war against the Christians with a devotion that matched anything in the West. Under him, the long fragmentation of the Muslim world, which had been Outremer's salvation, at last began to reverse. Piece by piece, the surrounding lands were being drawn together into one. And into the service of Nur ad-Din, as a young officer, there came a man whose name would echo down the ages, and who would prove the Crusaders' greatest and most terrible foe, though also, by the testimony of friend and enemy alike, one of the most honorable men of that or any age. He was a Kurd by birth, thoughtful and unassuming, and few who first met him guessed at his greatness. His name was Saladin. Saladin's rise was slow, and to some extent unlooked for. He came to prominence in the service of his uncle, a general of Nur ad-Din on campaign in Egypt, that rich and ancient land to the south, then ruled by a fading dynasty. When his uncle died, the young Saladin, almost by accident, found himself the master of Egypt, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And from that great base, patiently over many years, he built his power. When Nur ad-Din died, Saladin gathered the fallen leaders' lands to himself as well, taking Damascus and the cities of Syria, until at last he had achieved the thing the Crusaders had always dreaded. He had united Egypt and Syria under a single strong hand, encircling the kingdom of Jerusalem on almost every side. The little Christian realm, which had survived so long by living in the gaps between its divided enemies, now faced one great power that all but surrounded it. And Saladin took up, with all his heart, the cause of the holy war, the struggle to drive the Christians from the sacred land and to restore Jerusalem to Islam. He was, by every account, a genuinely devout and merciful man, generous to the poor, faithful to his word, courteous even to his foes, utterly without the greed and cruelty that marked so many rulers of his day. But he was also a patient and relentless master of war, and his gaze was fixed, above all, upon the holy city. Yet even as this great shadow gathered in the east, the kingdom of Jerusalem found, in its hour of need, a champion of its own, one of the most extraordinary and tragic figures of the entire crusading age. He was the young King Baldwin IV, who came to the throne as a boy, brave and clever and beloved. But Baldwin bore a terrible affliction. He was a leper, doomed from childhood to a slow and cruel decline, his body failing him even as his spirit blazed. The Leper King, they called him, and his courage has rung down through the centuries. Though his disease slowly robbed him of his sight and the use of his limbs, he refused to yield to it or to abandon his kingdom in its peril. Again and again he rose from his sickbed to lead his armies in person, carried into battle when he could no longer sit a horse, defying both his enemy and his own dying body with a valor that awed all who saw it. His finest hour came while he was still a youth. Saladin, thinking the boy king weak and his kingdom easy prey, invaded with a great army, spreading out to plunder, careless of any resistance. But Baldwin, though desperately ill, gathered what small force he could and fell upon the scattered invaders by surprise, at a place called Montgassard. Against all odds, the young Leper King routed Saladin's host utterly, and sent the great Sultan fleeing back to Egypt with only a fragment of his army. It was a stunning victory, and it bought the kingdom precious years. The courage of the young Leper King is among the most moving things in this whole long story. From boyhood the disease crept through him, stealing first the feeling from his hands, then the strength from his limbs, and at the last the sight from his eyes, until he could not feel his own wounds, nor so much as hold the reins of a horse. Any lesser soul might have hidden away to die in the dark. Baldwin did the opposite. Again and again, when his kingdom stood in peril, the failing young king had himself lifted from his sickbed and carried to war upon a litter, or bound upright in his saddle, to lead his men in person. Half blind and crippled and in constant pain, he asked nothing of his soldiers that he would not bear himself, and they loved him for it and followed him into battle. It is one of the quiet wonders of the age that the bravest defender the holy city ever had was a dying boy who could barely lift a sword. But the years were running out, for Baldwin's body was failing fast. And as the brave young king weakened and neared his end, a terrible thing happened within his own kingdom. It began to tear itself apart. For Baldwin had no son, and the question of who would rule after him split the lords of Jerusalem into bitter, warring factions, each grasping for the crown, each hating the others more, at times, than they hated Saladin. On one side stood the wiser, older lords, men who understood how fragile their kingdom truly was, and who counseled caution and peace with Saladin while the balance held. On the other stood a reckless, hot-headed faction of newcomers and adventurers, hungry for glory and plunder, contemptuous of the careful diplomacy that had kept the kingdom alive. And as Baldwin faded, and then died young and worn out by his long struggle, it was the reckless party that seized control. Chief among these hotheads was a brutal and faithless baron named Reynold of Chatillon, a man who embodied everything worst in the Crusader nobility. Holding a great castle on the desert frontier, Reynold made his living by robbery, falling upon the rich Muslim trade caravans and the pilgrim routes, in flat defiance of the truces his own king had sworn. He was, in effect, a bandit lord, and his outrages gave Saladin both the provocation and the excuse he had long been waiting for. The final insult came when Raynald attacked a great caravan during a time of solemn truce, robbing and imprisoning its people, and mocking Saladin's demands for justice. It is even said he plundered pilgrims bound for the holy places of Islam and threatened the sacred cities themselves. Saladin, that patient and honorable man, was roused at last to a cold and terrible resolve. He swore a solemn oath that he would kill Raynald with his own hand, and he began to gather his whole strength for a reckoning. Meanwhile, the crown of Jerusalem had passed, through the kingdom's ruinous quarrels, to a weak and irresolute man named Guy, a handsome but hapless lord, raised up by the reckless faction, with neither the wisdom nor the will to master the strong and quarrelsome barons around him. At the very moment the kingdom faced its gravest peril, it was led by its least capable king, surrounded by its most foolish counselors. It was a recipe for catastrophe. And so, in the summer of the year 1187, Saladin came. He crossed the frontier with the greatest army the Muslim East had yet assembled, united and disciplined and ablaze with holy purpose, and he moved against the kingdom of Jerusalem to settle the long account once and for all. The reckoning that the wiser heads had dreaded for so long, and that the reckless had so heedlessly provoked, had come at last. The kingdom gathered its whole strength to meet him. Every knight, every soldier, every warrior monk it could muster, stripping the castles and cities bare of their defenders to form one great army, the largest it had ever fielded. It was all or nothing now. If this host could defeat Saladin, the kingdom might yet be saved. If it should be lost, then there would be nothing left to defend the holy city or any of it. Everything, the whole fate of Outremer, now hung upon a single throw. And the reckless King Guy, badly counseled, was about to throw it away. Saladin, cunning as ever, laid a snare. He fell upon the town of Tiberias, beside its lake, knowing that its lord's wife was trapped inside, hoping to lure the Christian army out to its rescue across a stretch of dry and waterless upland. In the Crusader camp, a fierce debate raged through the night. The wiser lords, including the very lord whose wife was besieged, begged the king not to march, to stay by the good springs, to let Tiberias fall if it must, rather than lead the whole army into a death trap. It was sound counsel, and King Guy at first agreed to it. But in the darkness the reckless faction worked upon him, taunting him with cowardice, until he changed his mind. And so, at dawn, against all wisdom, the great army of Jerusalem set out to cross the barren hills toward Tiberias, in the blazing heat of a Syrian July, with too little water and a long, dry road ahead. It was the fatal error, and Saladin had planned for it exactly. The march became a torment. Under the pitiless sun, weighed down by their heavy armor, the Crusaders suffered agonies of thirst, while Saladin's horsemen swarmed about them, harrying their flanks, cutting off any dash for water, choking them with smoke from grass fires lit in their path. By the time the exhausted, parched army struggled up to a barren hill crowned by two rocky outcrops, a place called the Horns of Hattin, it was surrounded and desperate, and all but destroyed already by heat and thirst. There, on that scorched hilltop, the great army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem met its end. Let us not dwell on the details of the fighting. It was less a battle than a slow strangulation of men too parched to stand. Charge after desperate charge failed to break the ring. By the day's end, the flower of the kingdom's chivalry lay dead or captive. The king himself was taken, and the most sacred relic in the land, a fragment of the true cross that the Crusaders bore before them into battle, was lost into Saladin's hands. It was a catastrophe without parallel. In a single day, the entire military strength of Outremer had been annihilated. Saladin treated most of his royal and noble captives with his customary courtesy, and King Guy he spared, giving him water with his own hands as a sign that his life was safe. But for two he made exception. The warrior monks of the military orders, his most implacable foes, he put to death. And Reynold of Chatillon, the faithless bandit lord, Saladin struck down himself, keeping the solemn oath he had sworn. And now, with no army left to oppose him, Saladin swept through the defenseless kingdom like a flood. City after city, castle after castle, opened its gates or fell after only token resistance, for there were no soldiers left to man the walls. They lay dead or captive at Hattin. Within a few short months, nearly the whole of the Crusader kingdom, built up over 90 years, had passed into Saladin's hands. And at last he turned toward the greatest prize of all, Jerusalem itself. The holy city was crowded with refugees and almost empty of fighting men. Its defense fell to a single brave lord named Balian, who had escaped from Hattin, and who now did what he could with a garrison of old men, priests, and boys. He knew the city could not truly be held, but he meant to win the best terms he could for its people, and he defended the walls fiercely enough to make Saladin prefer a bargain to a bloody storming. When at last the walls were breached and further resistance became hopeless, Balian went out to negotiate the city's surrender. And here the two faiths and the two ages stood in the sharpest possible contrast. For when the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem 88 years before, they had drowned it in blood. Now, when Saladin took it back, he chose another way entirely, a way that would make his name a byword, even among his enemies, for mercy and honor. Saladin agreed that the people of Jerusalem might ransom themselves and go free, and he set the ransom low, and for the many who could not pay, he and his brother let great numbers go without payment at all, unwilling to see the poor sold into slavery. There was no massacre, no sack, no slaughter in the streets. The Christian inhabitants were allowed to depart in peace, with their lives and much of their goods, escorted safely to the coast. The holy places were protected. It was an act of clemency that astonished the world. And so the Christian people of Jerusalem gathered up what little they could carry, and went out from the holy city in long, sorrowful columns, down the weary road toward the coast and the ships that would bear them away. It might have been a scene of horror, as such departures so often were. Instead, it became a lesson in mercy. Saladin's own brother, moved by the plight of the poorest, asked as his reward the freedom of 1,000 of them, and set them loose without a coin. And Saladin himself freed many more, the old, the widowed, the helpless, unwilling to see them sold into slavery. Knights and chroniclers of the West, who had every reason to hate him, set these things down with wonder, and could not help but honor the courtesy of the man who had beaten them. In an age and a war so often drowned in blood, the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin stands out as a rare and shining example of what mercy and victory might look like, and it shamed, by its very gentleness, the memory of how the Crusaders themselves had once taken the very same city. And so, in the autumn of 1187, Jerusalem passed once more into Muslim hands, where it would remain, but for a brief interval, for centuries to come. Saladin entered the city he had longed for, and the crescent rose again over its walls, and the holy places of Islam were restored. For the Muslim world, it was a moment of triumph and rejoicing after 90 years of loss. For Christendom, when the news arrived, it was a blow of almost unimaginable weight. It is said that when word reached Rome that Jerusalem had fallen, the aged Pope died of grief at the news. Across all of Europe, the tidings fell like a great darkness. The holy city, won at such cost by their grandfathers, the very jewel and purpose of the whole crusading age, was lost. A wave of shock and shame and grief swept the West, and out of it, inevitably, rose the cry for a new crusade, the greatest yet, to win back what had been lost. And this time, the call was answered by the three mightiest monarchs in all of Christendom. The old and revered Emperor of Germany, Frederick, called Barbarossa for his red beard, a warrior of legend. The King of France, Philip, shrewd and cold and calculating. And the King of England, a man who would become, in the songs and stories of ages, the very image of the crusading knight, Richard, called the Lionheart. So rest now before the last great clash. The kingdom has fallen, the holy city is lost, but across the sea the kings of Europe are taking up the cross once more, and the mightiest of all the crusades is gathering. Its hero will be a warrior king of terrible prowess, and its enemy the noblest of all Islam's champions, and the two of them will contend across the Holy Land in a struggle that has never been forgotten. But that is for the waking hours. For now, let the darkness close softly and sleep. The first to set out was the old Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and his was the greatest army of all. A vast and disciplined German host, so large that its coming struck fear into Saladin himself. Barbarossa chose the old overland road and led his mighty force across Anatolia, fighting his way through, an aged warrior at the head of a great crusade, seemingly unstoppable. And then, in a moment of almost unbearable anticlimax, disaster struck from a clear sky. Crossing a river in the summer heat, the old emperor, whether his horse stumbled or his heart failed in the cold water, was thrown and drowned in a shallow stream far from any battlefield. In an instant, the whole great enterprise collapsed. Leaderless and stricken with grief, the magnificent German army lost heart and fell apart. Most of it turned back, and only a broken fragment ever reached the Holy Land. The mightiest of the three hosts was gone before it had struck a blow that left the two kings of the West, Richard of England and Philip of France, uneasy rivals who distrusted each other deeply, but who now sailed east together by sea. Richard, the Lionheart, was the very soul of the age of chivalry. Enormous in stature, fearless to the point of recklessness, a peerless soldier and battle commander, generous and cruel by turns, happier on campaign than on any throne. Of all the warriors the Crusades produced, none shone more brightly or more terribly than he. The two kings came at last to the Holy Land, where the surviving Crusaders had for 2 long years been locked in a desperate siege of the great port of Acre, a siege in which the besiegers were themselves half besieged by Saladin's relieving army, in one of the most grueling struggles of the whole war. The arrival of the two kings, and above all the energy and skill of Richard, at last tipped the balance. Under the hammer of his assaults, the mighty city of Acre surrendered. It was a great victory, but it was stained by a dark deed. In the wrangling over the terms, when Saladin was slow to fulfill the agreed ransom for the city's garrison, Richard, cold and impatient, had the thousands of Muslim prisoners of Acre put to death in sight of Saladin's army. It was an act of calculated ruthlessness that has shadowed his name ever since, a reminder that even the flower of chivalry could be pitiless, and that this remained, for all its songs and banners, a brutal and merciless war. Soon after the fall of Acre, King Philip of France, who had never loved the venture, and who saw greater opportunities at home while Richard was far away, declared himself ill and sailed back to Europe, leaving the crusade behind. And so the whole weight of it now fell upon Richard alone. From this point on, the Third Crusade became, in effect, a single long duel between two extraordinary men, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the finest soldier and the noblest ruler of their age, matched against each other for the Holy Land. Of Richard the Lionheart, so many tales were told, in his own day and long after, that the man himself is half lost in legend. But even the sober truth is remarkable. He was a giant of a man for his age, red gold and towering, of enormous strength and reckless personal courage, who fought in the front rank where the danger was thickest, and seemed to bear a charmed life amid the arrows and the blades. Soldiers on both sides spoke his name with awe, and it was said that mothers in the East would hush their children with the warning that King Richard was near. He could be generous, and he could be cruel, chivalrous one hour and pitiless the next. He was a far better soldier than he was a king, and he loved the clash of the campaign more than the slow business of ruling. But as a captain of war he had few equals in that or any age. A soldier's eye for the ground and for the moment to strike, an iron grip on his own hot temper in the heat of battle, and a gift for making tired, frightened men believe that with him at their head, they simply could not lose. The siege of Acre, where the crusade had ground to a halt before he came, was itself an ordeal of legend. For 2 long years the Christians had sat before its walls, themselves half besieged by Saladin's army at their backs, in a struggle of such misery, disease, and stubbornness that thousands had died there without a single great battle being fought. Into this weary deadlock the Lionheart came like a fresh wind, and under the hammer of his energy and his siege engines, The mighty city that had defied the crusade for 2 years surrendered within weeks of his arrival. Richard's aim was Jerusalem, and to reach it he first had to march his army south down the coast, from Acre toward the port of Jaffa, with Saladin's forces shadowing him the whole way, waiting for a chance to strike. Richard handled the march masterfully, keeping his columns tight and disciplined, his ranks unbroken, refusing to let the enemy's harassment provoke him into disorder, protecting his men from the heat and the arrows with iron control. It was a model of generalship, and Saladin could find no opening. At last, near a place called Arsuf, Saladin committed his whole army to a great attack, hoping to overwhelm the Crusaders as they marched. For hours Richard held his men in check under a punishing assault, forbidding them to break ranks, absorbing the blows, waiting for the perfect moment. And when at last he loosed his knights in a great charge, the timing was so devastating that Saladin's army was routed from the field. Arsuf was a shining victory, and it proved that even the great Saladin could be beaten by the Lionheart in open battle. And yet, for all his victories, Richard faced a problem that no battle could solve. He could beat Saladin in the field. He could take the coastal cities, but Jerusalem lay inland, ringed by hills, and even if he stormed it, he had not the men to hold it once his crusaders went home. Twice his army advanced into the Judean hills, close enough to glimpse the holy city in the distance, and twice, after agonized councils, Richard judged that to take it would be folly, and gave the bitter order to turn back. It is said that on one of these marches, when a companion urged Richard to come and look upon Jerusalem in the distance, the great warrior covered his eyes with his shield and would not look, saying that he who was not worthy to deliver the holy city was not worthy to behold it. Whether the tale is true or not, it captures the tragedy of his position perfectly. The mightiest soldier in Christendom, who had crossed the world and beaten Saladin again and again, could not take the one prize he had come for. Through all their long struggle, a strange and famous mutual respect grew up between the two adversaries. Though they never met face to face, they exchanged messages and gifts and courtesies across the lines. When Richard fell sick with fever, Saladin, his enemy, sent him fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to cool his brow. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 fine mounts. Each recognized in the other a greatness that transcended their enmity, and their chivalry toward one another became legend. But both men were nearing the end of their strength. Saladin's vast realm was weary of endless war. Richard was desperate to return home, where his throne was being undermined in his absence. Neither could win a final victory, neither could afford to fight on forever. And so, worn down by the long stalemate, these two great foes at last did the sensible and the human thing. They made peace. The treaty they agreed was a compromise, and like most compromises it satisfied no one fully, but it was wise and it was merciful. The Crusaders would keep the strip of coast they had reconquered, with Acre and the other ports, so that the little kingdom might live on. Jerusalem itself would remain in Saladin's hands. But, and this was the heart of it, Christian pilgrims would once again be free to travel, unarmed and in peace, to pray at the holy places of Jerusalem, as they had done long ago. It was, in its way, a return to where the whole long story had begun, to the simple matter of pilgrims and their access to a holy city. Rivers of blood had been shed, whole armies had perished, kingdoms had risen and fallen, and in the end the two exhausted sides had agreed upon very nearly the arrangement that had existed before the First Crusade ever set out. Richard, his truce made, sailed for home at last, without ever having entered Jerusalem. And within a few months of the peace, the great Sultan Saladin died, at Damascus, worn out by his labors. He had united the Muslim East, retaken the Holy City, and withstood the mightiest crusade the West could send, and yet he died with almost nothing to his own name, for he had given away his wealth as fast as it came to him, in charity and in gifts. Friend and foe alike mourned the passing of a truly great and honorable man. And with his death and Richard's departure, the heroic age of the Crusades drew toward its close. The crusading fever did not die with Saladin and Richard, but something in its spirit began, slowly, to sicken. This is shown, more than anywhere, by the strange and terrible tale of the Fourth Crusade, a venture that set out to recover Jerusalem and ended by committing one of the greatest crimes in the history of Christendom, without ever coming within 1,000 miles of the Holy Land. It began well enough. A new generation of knights took the cross, resolved this time to strike at the root of Muslim power by attacking Egypt. To carry their great army across the sea, they struck a bargain with the merchant city of Venice, that mighty sea power, which agreed to build an enormous fleet in exchange for a vast sum of money. But when the Crusaders gathered, far fewer came than had been promised, and they found, to their horror, that they could not begin to pay what they owed. The Venetians, having built the fleet at great cost, would not simply forgive the debt. Instead, their shrewd old leader proposed a bargain. He would suspend the debt if the Crusaders would first help Venice by attacking a certain troublesome city along the way. And so the Great Crusade, meant to free the Holy Land, made its very first act the storming of a Christian city on the Adriatic coast, turning its swords, before it had struck a single blow against the infidel, upon fellow Christians. The Pope was appalled and excommunicated the whole enterprise. But worse, far worse, was to come. For at this point there arrived in the Crusader camp a young prince of the Byzantine Empire, an exile whose father had been overthrown in one of Constantinople's endless palace intrigues. This prince made the Crusaders a dazzling offer. If they would only sail to Constantinople and place him upon the imperial throne, he would pay them fabulous sums and join the crusade with all his empire's might. It was a fatal temptation. And so the Fourth Crusade turned aside altogether and sailed not for Egypt or the Holy Land, but for Constantinople, the greatest, richest, and most magnificent Christian city in all the world, the very capital of Eastern Christendom, which the Crusaders had sworn to defend. They came as would-be kingmakers, meaning only to install their prince and collect their reward. But the affair went sour, as such affairs do. The prince could not pay what he had promised. The people of the city turned against him, and he was overthrown and killed. The Crusaders, cheated of their reward and camped hungry outside the walls of the wealthiest city on earth, made a dreadful decision. In the spring of the year 1204, they stormed Constantinople, and having taken it, they gave it over to a sack of unspeakable savagery. For 3 days, the soldiers of the cross plundered and burned and desecrated the greatest city in Christendom, carrying off or destroying the accumulated treasures and holy relics of 1,000 years. Let us pass over the details in sorrow. It was a horror that has never been forgotten. Much of the plunder was scattered across Europe, and some of it can still be seen to this day. The 4 great bronze horses that had stood in the city for the better part of 1,000 years were carried off by the Venetians to adorn the front of their own cathedral, where their likenesses stand yet, a glittering trophy of the day that Christians in the service of the cross sacked the greatest Christian city on earth. The gathered wealth of 1,000 years was broken up and hauled away into the West. It was one of the most shameful episodes in the whole of the age, a crusade blessed to free the Holy Land that instead destroyed the mightiest Christian empire in the world and dealt the Eastern Church a wound from which it never recovered. The old rift between the Christians of East and West, which the very first crusade had been meant, in part, to heal, was now torn open forever into a bitter hatred that endures, in some hearts, even to this day. Of Jerusalem, the Fourth Crusade achieved precisely nothing. After such a betrayal of its own ideals, the crusading movement never quite recovered its innocence. There followed, in the years after, a sad and telling episode remembered as the Children's Crusade, when, it is said, great throngs of the young and the poor, fired by visionary preaching, set out for the Holy Land in the sincere belief that their purity alone would succeed where armies had failed. It came, by every account, to a wretched and heartbreaking end, and it stands as a mournful symbol of a great idea curdling into delusion. Later crusades still went out, and some were led by able and pious men, but the tide of history had turned, and none could restore what had been lost. One great expedition struck at Egypt, the heart of Muslim power, and came achingly close to victory, before overreach and the flooding of the Nile turned triumph into surrender. The dream of taking Jerusalem by the sword was proving, again and again, to be beyond the strength of the West. There was one strange exception, a crusade that recovered Jerusalem without a battle at all. A brilliant and skeptical emperor, more at home in the cultured, many-faithed world of the Mediterranean than in the fervor of holy war, went east not to fight but to bargain, and by shrewd negotiation with the Sultan of Egypt, he won back Jerusalem for the Christians by a simple treaty. But it was a fragile, bloodless thing, resting on a paper agreement, and within a generation the holy city slipped from Christian hands once more, this time for good. The last great crusader of the classic age was a king of surpassing goodness, Louis of France, so pious and so just that his own church would in time declare him a saint. Twice this holy king took the cross and led great crusades against the power of Egypt and North Africa. And twice, despite all his virtue and his courage, he met with disaster, captured with his whole army in the mud of the Nile the first time, and dying of plague on the shores of Africa the second, his last crusade dissolving in sickness and grief upon a foreign strand. There is something deeply moving in the story of that last great Crusader king. Louis of France was a man of genuine and unaffected holiness, just, humble, and merciful, who washed the feet of the poor and could not bear to see a wrong go unrighted. When he took the cross the first time and led his army against Egypt, he came close to victory and then lost everything. His host was trapped by sickness and the flooding Nile, and the Saint King himself was taken prisoner and had to be ransomed at a vast price before he could go free. A lesser or a wiser man might have counted the lesson learned and stayed home. But the memory of the Holy Land never left him, and years later, an old man now, he took the cross a second time and sailed for the coast of North Africa. There the venture came to nothing at all. Plague swept through his camp upon the sun-baked shore, and it carried off the king himself, who died murmuring the name of Jerusalem, the city he had given his whole heart to and had never once been permitted to see. The death of that saintly king, far from home, his crusade collapsing around him, marked, as much as any single moment, the end of the great age of crusading. The fire that Urban had lit at Clermont, that had sent hundreds of thousands marching across the world, had burned for the better part of 2 centuries, and now at last it was guttering low. The West was growing weary of the endless cost, in gold and in blood, of a dream that seemed ever further from its grasp. And while the crusading spirit faded in the West, a new and formidable power had risen in the East to finish what Saladin had begun. In Egypt, a caste of warrior slaves called the Mamluks, the finest soldiers of their day, bred and trained to war from childhood, had seized power, and under a succession of hard and brilliant leaders they turned their full might against the last remnants of Outremer. Grimly, methodically, castle by castle and city by city, they set about erasing the Crusader presence from the Holy Land altogether. There was no great battle now, no dramatic reversal, only the slow, remorseless shrinking of the Crusader lands, as one stronghold after another fell to the Mamluk armies and was not retaken. The great castles that had stood for generations were stormed or surrendered. The inland territories were lost, and the once proud kingdom of Outremer was squeezed back year by year to a narrow strip of coast and a handful of ports, and finally to a single great city, standing almost alone against the gathering dark. That last great city was Acre, the same port whose long siege had been the making of Richard the Lionheart, a century before. Now, in the year 1291, it stood as the final stronghold of the Crusader world, a rich and crowded city behind mighty walls, the last foothold of the West in the Holy Land. And against it the Mamluks brought an enormous army, and a great host of siege engines, resolved to make an end at last of 200 years of crusading. The defenders of Acre fought with the desperate courage of men who knew there was nowhere left to go. The knights of the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, whose long story had begun in these very lands, made their last stand here and died, most of them where they had always fought, in the front line, refusing to yield. For weeks the great city held, under a ceaseless storm of stone and fire, while the ships in its harbor carried away those who could flee. But no courage could save it now. The walls were breached, the towers fell, and the great city was overwhelmed at last. Let us not linger on that final, dreadful day. It was the end that so many Crusader cities had met before, and it was not gentle. When it was over, Acre lay in ruins, and its defenders were dead or fled or taken. And with the fall of Acre, the last great city of Outremer was gone. The few remaining footholds along the coast, leaderless and hopeless, were swiftly abandoned. Within a matter of weeks, the whole Crusader presence in the Holy Land, which had endured for the better part of 2 centuries, simply ceased to be. The banners came down. The last ships sailed away into the west, and the long, extraordinary chapter that Urban had opened at Clermont came, quietly and finally, to its close. The land beyond the sea had passed out of Christian hands, and would not return. And so we come to the end of the Great Crusades. 200 years of holy war, hundreds of thousands of lives, untold suffering, courage, cruelty, and faith. And at the last, the Crusaders were left with nothing of what they had set out to win. The holy city they had crossed the world to take remained, as it had begun, in other hands. By the cold measure of its own stated purpose, the whole vast enterprise had, in the end, failed. And yet its consequences would echo down through all the centuries that followed, in ways its participants could never have foreseen. For 200 years, the peoples of Europe and the Middle East had been thrown together, in war but also in trade, in hatred but also, sometimes, in a grudging mutual regard. And through that long contact, the isolated, inward-looking West had been opened, as never before, to the wider and often more advanced world beyond its borders. Europe took much from the encounter. Through the Crusader ports and the merchants of Venice and Genoa, a great flow of goods and ideas came west, the spices and silks and sugar of the East, but also its learning, the mathematics, the medicine, the philosophy, and the recovered wisdom of the ancient world, much of it preserved and enriched by the scholars of Islam. In ways impossible to measure, the Crusades helped to draw Europe out of its long isolation and set it slowly upon the road toward the wider age that was to come. But the darker legacy was heavy too, and it has proved longer-lived. The Crusades left behind a deep well of bitterness between the Christian and Muslim worlds, and between the eastern and western branches of Christianity, that has never entirely run dry. Wrongs done in those 2 centuries have been remembered and nursed and invoked for many hundreds of years since by those who would stir up hatred. It is one of the sorrows of history that so much faith and so much courage should have left, among their fruits, so long a harvest of division. What, then, are we to make of them, these men and women of the cross across the great gulf of the centuries? It is easy to judge them harshly, and much of what they did deserves it. But they were not simply villains nor simply heroes. They were human beings of a distant age, moved by a faith we can scarcely imagine, capable of breathtaking courage and endurance, and of terrible cruelty, often in the very same hour. They believed with all their hearts that they were doing the will of God. And whatever we conclude, we cannot deny the sheer astonishing scale of what they attempted, this outpouring of a whole civilization, marching across the known world, again and again over 200 years in pursuit of a city and a dream. In its grandeur and its folly, its nobility and its horror, the crusading age remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in the whole long story of humankind. A mirror in which we may see, reflected together, the very best and the very worst of what people are capable of when they believe. Spare a thought, before we close, for the countless nameless ones. Not the kings and the sultans whose names we still remember, but the ordinary men and women who walked those long roads, and who lie now in unmarked graves scattered along them, from the fields of France to the walls of distant Acre. They left no chronicles and no monuments. They went because they believed, and they suffered more than any of the great, and history has forgotten almost every one of them. It is right, at the very last, to remember that they were there. And spare a thought, too, for the people of the East, whose land it was all along, the villagers and townsfolk of Syria and Palestine, Muslim and Jewish and Christian alike, caught for 200 years between the great armies, whose homes became the battlefield, and who endured, generation after generation, a storm they had never asked for. In the end, perhaps the deepest and the simplest truth of the Crusades is this: that it was the humble and the unremembered on every side who paid the greatest price of all for the dreams of the mighty. So let their long story rest here, at its close, as you yourself are surely resting now. From a sermon in a French field to the last ships pulling away from burning Acre, it spanned 2 centuries and half a world. It began with a road and a holy city, and it ended, after all the blood and glory, with pilgrims once more walking that road in peace, which is, perhaps, in the end, all that most of them had ever truly wanted. There is a kind of somber wisdom to carry away from a tale like this, down into sleep. It is the knowledge of how much good and ill can flow from a single burning idea, how thin the line can be between devotion and destruction, and how the deeds of long-dead generations still shape the world we wake to each morning. History is not only a story of the past. It is the slow making of the present, and we are all still living in its long aftermath. But let those thoughts grow soft and dim now, and let the great procession of knights and kings and pilgrims fade gently into the dark, like a tapestry in a shadowed hall. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. No names, no dates, no battles. Let them all drift away, and keep only the quiet feeling of the thing. The long roads, the golden castles, the far-off holy city shining in the eastern sun. You are warm and you are safe, and the night is long, and there is all the time in the world to rest. Let your breath come slow and deep. Let the last cares of the day loosen their hold, one by one, and fall away into the dark. The great story is told, and the fire has burned low, and there is nothing left to do now but to sleep. Thank you for spending this quiet while with me, and with the long, strange story of the Crusades. If these gentle histories bring you peace, there will be another waiting for you tomorrow night, and the night after that, whenever you have need of a soft voice in the dark. But do not trouble yourself with that now. Now there is only rest. Sleep well wherever in the world you are, and whatever hour it is where you lie. The lamp is going out. The long night has come. And the old story of that faraway city will keep safe and sound until we meet again. Good night.